It's Effective, Empowered and Empathetic, CV and Interview Prep. As most of you know, the Lunch and Learn is a series of information sessions for members and for representatives in Forsa on topics of both relevance and interest to our membership, but also that will complement what we do as part of Skills Academy in terms of our training programme. So just a bit of housekeeping. We'll run this until just 2 o'clock, and we'll take questions through the chat throughout, but we'll kind of keep the questions together at the end. So when Rebecca has finished her presentation, I'll pose the questions to her. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We are recording this session, so it will be available for viewing on our Skills Academy YouTube channel at the end, probably by not Monday, it's bank holiday, but by Tuesday or Wednesday next week. So people can view it again if there's tips and information that they want to see repeated, but also if there's other people in your work location who haven't had a chance to log on, please forward it to them, and I'm sure they'd be delighted to view it. Just also to mention that this is general information around CV and interview prep. It's not specific to any particular work location, so just to bear that in mind. As Skills Academy, we are interested, if people are interested in other topics, or if there's topics that you really want to hear more about, please drop us a line to skillsacademy@forsa.ie, and we'll bear that in mind in terms of our fuller programme and also in terms of future Lunch and Learn sessions. So I am very happy to welcome our guest today. She's a colleague. She's our HR director in Forsa. Her name is Rebecca Wolf. She's a wonderful woman. She has been with us since 2021. It feels like she's been with us forever, but she's been with us only since 2021, has made some significant changes inside our organisation. But prior to that, she worked in HR and operations in the international educational not-for-profit sector. So she's well experienced in a lot of the HR work that she's involved in now. So she loves providing humane resources to workers, and she certainly does that for us within the staff in Forsa. So I'm delighted to hand over the session now to Rebecca Wolf, and take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. As Fiona mentioned, before I transitioned to an HR career 18 years ago, I worked in experiential education and career development. So I really love helping people grow towards fulfilling work lives. There's some other altruistic reasons that I'm happy to be here. One of our key values in Forsa HR is identifying the strengths in our candidates. We are not looking to trip people up. We want to see the best in people. And we want our employees and members to be empowered not only in their jobs, but in the job market too. But from a selfish perspective, it's not personally or professionally fulfilling to spend hours immersed in CVs and interviews that aren't working for me and aren't working for the candidate. So woe is me, right? I have to stomp all over people's hopes and dreams all day. And I want to acknowledge that there really is an imbalance in the hiring interaction, and usually employers have the power, and that's the power to make the offer. So why would you have empathy for the people with power over you? Well, two answers there. The first one's kind of obvious, like why not? Empathy is usually a force for good, so go for it. The second reason is less altruistic. If you really understand the people with the power to make that decision and what their motivations and needs are, you can meet those needs, or in other words, give them exactly what they need to hire you. So what is driving that relationship, what's driving the people with the power in the relationship? So we know that with power comes great responsibility. We are the Spider-Men of the hiring relationship. I just want to be clear, I'm speaking from the perspective of an ethical employer. So an ethical employer will be aware of obligations that they have to the organization as a whole to attract and select the best person possible for the job, and more specifically to current employees in that organization. So that's especially true when you're hiring someone who's going to manage other people. We have obligations to the applicants and candidates, including internal candidates, to describe the role, the working conditions, and compensation accurately. We also have to respect their privacy and protect their data. We also really shouldn't be wasting their time with unnecessary screening, irrelevant processes, or onerous interview tasks. And when we do offer somebody a role, we really don't do this lightly. For a new employee, accepting a position may mean they're starting a new role with a fresh probationary period, and that means leaving stable, secure employment, possibly even relocating their families. So for many reasons, we really need our new hires to succeed. So how do we go about meeting these obligations? All right, well, let's look behind the curtain. The first thing I do in interview training with a board is ask them the question, what are we doing here? So we're filling an organizational need. And the answer is we're trying to identify the person who is most likely to succeed in the role and in the organization. So what are some ways that you do that? You can toss a coin. You can promote just based on seniority. You can go with the Klingon promotional path, which for the non-trekkers out there is murdering your superior officer. But today, most organizations rely on the concept of identifying the competencies required to succeed in a role, and then screening applications and interviewing candidates to determine who has the most evidence of those competencies. In practice, this means most employers are looking for people who have already successfully performed the same or similar job, or who have demonstrated the same competencies in another role. So what is a competency? Because we're going to talk about that a lot. So I think we should have sort of a set definition here. A competency is a set of related skills, knowledge, and behaviors. These frequently overlap with each other, and different organizations may define these a little differently. So using this example, and this is a framework that I used to use with my students, we see that some of the skills and behaviors associated with the competency of critical thinking and problem solving include mental flexibility, research skills, creativity, and some others. Communication includes speaking, listening, foreign language skills, and confidence. We also see confidence with leadership, and that adds in a few others, including appreciation of other viewpoints and organization, which also is shared with teamwork and collaboration, which if you go back a few steps, it also shares mental flexibility with critical thinking and problem solving. Competencies are the foundation of how you need to describe your experience and accomplishments when you prepare your CV or prepare yourself for an interview. So I love this picture because in my mind, the center of the Venn diagram of trade unionists and cheerleaders is the megaphone. So getting on to those first steps when you're creating your CV. CV and interviews are formal. That's not in the sense that they're ceremonial or fancy, but they tend to follow set conventions and forms. We're going to talk about those more later, but I just want to speak for a moment about what is usually the most challenging part of the process. And that's the first step of recognizing and articulating your own accomplishments. For many people, talking about their accomplishments and best qualities is challenging. It can go against deeply ingrained cultural and usually gender conditioning. I think the best place to start with creating your CV is to give yourself some time to reflect about your experience and your career as though you were a different person, someone that you would be a lot kinder to than you are to yourself. Our inner voice is often not very kind, and Irish culture, whether you were raised in it or you just live in it like me, discourages pretentiousness and boastfulness or anything that verges on it. It's one of my favorite things about living here, but it's a real disadvantage when you're doing the first draft of your CV. So if you are struggling, look for a cheerleader. So ideally, this person has worked with you and can point out accomplishments you may have minimized. You can also ask trusted colleagues or former colleagues if you can look at their CVs and see how they describe and highlight similar work. And while I'm generally not a fan of LinkedIn, it can be a great resource for seeing how people with similar roles describe their skills and experience. So on to the CV. We'll talk a little bit about the basic forms that can take. I've used some examples here. I've taken them from the Harvard Extension School career website and a private company called Boost CV. I will share those links with the Skills Academy, but there's loads of resources out on the internet. These are just two that I think had particularly good examples. So the main types of CVs are the reverse chronological CV, a skills-based CV, and the hybrid. So the first one we're looking at here, and apologies because it's really hard to read these, but this is the reverse chronological CV. This starts with education, and then starting with the current or most recent role, outlines your past work experience, ending in this case with a section on volunteer experience. This is really the classic model. It's solid. It works well for people whose education and past work experience are clearly aligned with the role for which they're applying. This one is a skills-based CV, and these are really useful if you're just starting out in your career or if you're trying to shift to a new field or industry. So in this case, it starts with a descriptive paragraph. It's almost like an elevator pitch, to use sort of awful tech language, describing the candidate. Then there's a brief line here for language skills. And then here, where you'd normally see this body outlining work experience, it's broken up into categories for different competencies. And these include brief bullet points with examples of how this person has used the skills related to those competencies. There's another little section on software skills. and then a brief listing of professional and academic experience. In this case, their work experience is actually 1 2-month internship. That would look really meager on a reverse chronological CV, but it looks great here. And then you get the hybrid, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of a mashup of the two. So in this case, we've got somebody who is prominently featuring their skills here. In this case, it's technical skills, but it just as easily could be something like people management, customer service, payroll, whatever is appropriate for you. And then it proceeds much like the reverse chronological CV. I usually advise people to kind of have one massive master CV document, and then you cut that down and edit it on the basis of the roles for which you're applying. If you're applying for a job that fits naturally with your past experience, you might opt for the reverse chronological or hybrid. If you're looking to move to a role that doesn't seem like an obvious fit, you use a skills-based CV to highlight that you have the relevant competencies to perform the role. So I want to cover here 2 fairly basic pieces of advice, but I really do think that they're valuable to keep in mind as you are creating your CV, and that's to use active language and to highlight results and outcomes. So here, it's the difference between saying I was responsible for a team of 5 people versus I led a team of 5 people. It really does bring a lot more energy to the document, and there's a lot of online resources, including the Harvard Extension School that I mentioned before, that have great lists and examples of active words that you can use. Another practice that's become really popular to the point that it's almost expected at this stage is to highlight particular achievements and outcomes. I've seen this used as a separate section or just as bullet points within a section of work history. So here we have an example like I increased engagement by 240%, or reduced average response times from 16 to 3 working days. The caveat here is you really have to be able to back up those statements, so don't just invent some numbers, even though I think it can be tempting for some people. So before I get to the point where I talk about what kind of CVs I think work really well and get those results, I'm going to digress and talk a little bit about applying for jobs in the internet age. So from an employer's perspective, the internet is great. I can reach so many potential employees. Also, the internet is a nightmare. I am drowning in unqualified applicants. The internet has made it very easy both to advertise and to apply for jobs. So the volume of applications has in many ways degraded the process and created a vicious circle of more candidates applying than an organization can thoughtfully screen. Organizations are ignoring basic manners like acknowledging an application, letting unsuccessful applicants know their status within a reasonable amount of time, even ghosting people. Job seekers start to see the process as capricious or just a numbers game, and then they start submitting generic applications for which they're clearly not qualified, or they forget their manners and start referencing completely other jobs and companies in their applications. So the sheer numbers involved can make it really difficult for your CV to stand out. And I think this is the reason I get a disproportionate amount of questions from people about formatting and templates as opposed to language, content, and emphasis. So when I talk about formatting, which I'm going to do in a second, these are guidelines more than hard and fast rules. I can tell you what I like and dislike about the look of a CV and what I think other HR professionals like, but this is really subjective. When it comes to content, there's a lot more consensus. What HR professionals want are applications that look as though the candidate read the job description carefully and presented the relevant and only the relevant experience, skills, and qualifications in a concise, easy to find, and easy to read format. So what are some of these formatting questions I get? Should I use color? Cool fonts. Unless you're in a creative or design-led field, graphic-heavy templates and designs are really not necessary. If you think back to those examples I shared earlier, which, this is they're shared amongst a lot of HR people. A lot of people like those Harvard Extension School samples. They were not full of fancy formatting, right? They tend, they're not really necessary, and they often pull your focus from the content. They're also usually a lot more difficult to edit and customize per each application. Also consider that an interview board may only see the CV in hard copy printed in black and white. The main thing to keep in mind with fonts is that they should be easy to read and not too small. Also, please just use normal margins. The other big question is length. Some people insist that you absolutely cannot go to more than one page. And while it is true that something that you put on the first page of the CV is much more likely to be read than something on the third page, it isn't unreasonable for people who are 15 or more years into their career to need 2 or 3 pages of a CV. That said, I find very long CVs are also the ones least likely to be customized. It's very much a throw everything at the wall and see what sticks approach, I think, from candidates. This makes the employer have to work hard and invest a lot of time to pick out the information that they need. Some of them just won't bother, and others, if they do bother, might start to resent you for it. So other things, pictures, do I include my home address, reference details? I find that these use up valuable real estate and they don't really add anything to the CV. There's a couple of exceptions to this, which I'll address later. So social media, unless your social media activity demonstrates your professional knowledge and expertise, so such as a LinkedIn page, or if you're frequently commenting on issues relevant to your role on Twitter, it probably isn't necessary and it could actually be harmful. That's kind of a judgment call and probably needs a little bit more discussion. And also I think it's probably a training call in and of itself. So just to reiterate, the CVs that jump out to me as an employer are those that clearly address the requirements as set out in the job description. So just a little digression here about that. And how AI is being used in recruitment now. A lot of larger organizations do use AI and keywords to screen applications. I want to be clear that Forza doesn't do that. And I've started to see things like TikTok tips on how to game these AIs, doing things like pasting the job description in a transparent font in the footer of your CV. Please don't do this. A lot of standard PDF readers and HR software end up displaying this text as a background image. You absolutely should reflect the language that's in the job description in your application, but don't do it through cut and paste. That said, right, AI can be a useful tool in this. I think it's primarily good for writer's block. It's great for a first draft of your CV or your cover letter, but make sure that the final product represents your intelligence. All right, so just to summarize things that you should definitely include in your CV. Your essential contact information. So mostly that's just going to be phone number and a work appropriate email address. So not like sneakypints@gmail.com. Consider just getting a different email address if your one that you use in your personal life is not work appropriate. You should have a concise description of the relevant experience, skills, and knowledge. For education, the highest qualifications or degrees that you've attained. If you have a post-secondary qualification, do not include your secondary or leaving cert results unless the employer has specifically asked for these. And then definitely include anything that the employer has requested within the law. So some things to maybe include in your CV. So here I've said home address, and I know earlier I said that takes up valuable real estate, probably literally as well as metaphorically, but it can be helpful to include if it's not clear that you're based near where the role is located. Visa status, unfortunately, some employers will make wildly incorrect assumptions about people's legal status to work in Ireland based on their name and work history. So that might be something you might want to consider putting in if you're not getting a response or traction from your CV. Training courses, please only include things that are recent and relevant. Employers will start to resent reading pages upon pages of every webinar that you've attended over the last 10 years. Hobbies and interests can be great if they're supporting your overall professional narrative. So for example, coaching a sports team is a great example of leadership. So absolutely include that if you have the space. References or even writing references available on request, only put that in if specifically requested by the employer. Most employers know that you have references and that they will be available on request. So again, use that space for something else. If you want to include like significant volunteer and work experience, you absolutely can just fit that into the general work experience section, professional experience section. Just make it clear that that was volunteer or extracurricular work. So things to never include, marital status, family status, date of birth. If employers are asking for that, they should not be. And they, as an employer, I don't want to know that at all. Things like favorite quotations, books, and songs, this isn't relevant, it looks like filler, and you're giving up valuable real estate for something that you could have used to highlight the information that the employer actually needs. Also, please do not submit additional documents like copies of degrees, certificates, and that kind of thing unless it's been requested. And then finally, just the big points on the CV. The main thing that you can do that's going to really give you the best chance of your CV getting you an interview is to customize and review the CV based on the job description for the role that you're applying for. Make the relevant experience, skills, and knowledge easy to find. Remember that it is your CV's job to get you an interview, not to represent your entire life, personal philosophy, and value as a human being. Proofread your CV, then ask someone else to do it, and then you do it again. And then finally, I suggest saving your CV as a PDF. You have more control over the way it displays and prints if you do that. And use your name in the document's title. So as an example, I would call mine Wolf Rebecca CV.pdf, not just Force a CV. It's just one of those things that makes the employer's life a little bit easier, and they probably will like you more for it. We're just going to go through cover letters quickly because cover letters are pretty straightforward. It should be one page. It is not a novel or a treatise. It's an opportunity to highlight particularly relevant experience if your application is an obvious fit, and to connect the dots if it isn't immediately apparent why you might be applying for the role. So for example, if you're changing industries or applying for a position that appears more junior than your current one. So the first paragraph, it's 3 paragraphs, 1 page. Express your interest in the role, tell them how you heard about it, and then a brief summary of your interest and the fit for the role. Paragraph 2 is you connect those dots, give a couple of specific examples of how your experience fits and why you make sense for the role. And then paragraph 3 is thank them for considering the application, reiterate your interest, let them know how they can contact you if they have any questions, and tell them that you're looking forward to the opportunity to discuss your application. So if you get that opportunity to discuss your application, we usually call that an interview. What's going on? What are interviews? So the first thing to know about interviews is that most employers realize that these are not a perfect tool, or actually most good employers realize that these are not a perfect tool. Most interviewers will overestimate their own competence at making decisions. They'll rely on a gut feeling. Unconscious bias is a real factor in interviewing. So, that looks like tending to hire people we like, and then tending to like people who are like us. And then suddenly your organization has no diversity in it and not the range of skills that it needs. So how do employers get around this? So again, an ethical employer addresses bias by acknowledging it and acknowledging that it's real and working against it consciously. The most common tool for doing this is called the structured interview. So briefly, this means that you're asking the same questions with the same language to every candidate. This creates a more level playing field. This also gives you an opportunity to use your empathy to get a little advantage in this case, because behind the scenes, believe it or not, interview boards are made up of people. And people, after 7 hours sitting in a chair asking the same questions over and over, their energy can flag. If you keep your energy up and give concise answers, you are at a real advantage in the interview process. Competency and skill-based interviews are focused on examples, right? So most of the questions are going to start with things like, give us an example or tell me about a time. A good skills-based interview, structured interview, will focus on questions that are designed to elicit concrete, recent examples of the skills, experience, knowledge, and behaviors relevant to the job. Again, that's competencies. So what is this going to look like for you? You need to create a short story collection about your competencies. So what that means is that you need to prepare and practice 10 to 12 examples from your professional life. You can bring in sort of some extracurricular things. So if you've got examples about coaching that sports team, that's fine to bring in, but really the focus should be on your professional life. These examples of individual competencies should be no longer than 3 minutes. You need to practice them over and over. They should absolutely trip off your tongue. Something to keep in mind is that you can cross-reference these. So for example, let's say you have a story in which you identified that your team was struggling with a changed feature in some essential software. You created a support video and shared it. This would show strong IT skills, problem solving, and teamwork. So you could have that cross-referenced across those different areas. If you get a question that comes up about an example about your teamwork, that you can bring that one out. But then later, if you get another specific teamwork question, you probably have another competency or another example that addresses multiple competencies, one of them being teamwork. You may have heard about some techniques for developing these examples. So one of them is STAR, which stands for Situation, Task, Action, Result, or BAC, Background, Action, Conclusion. I think basically that just means beginning, middle, and end. What you're doing there is you're setting up what is the context, what's the background to this example. That should be no more than about 30 seconds. You want to focus most of that 3 minutes on the action you took and the great outcomes that came from it. I know a lot of smart people really love context and they love the nuance of that. But the backstory and context, in my experience, is where candidates often wander into the weeds of office politics, things to do with organizations that are not relevant to the interview board sitting in front of them, and they really lose the board's attention there. So again, 3 minutes, only 30 seconds on the background, and even less if you can do that. You should expect follow-up questions to these examples. So things like, would you have done anything differently? Did you learn anything from that? You may get questions that are asking you for examples of how you coped with failure or not having enough resources. So again, you have to be able to kind of put that positive spin on the end. Another thing that kind of a lot of people have made a big deal about in interviews is using I instead of we. That's fine, and generally you probably do want to be putting the emphasis on your own contribution in these examples. However, we all work as part of teams, and I think as trade unionists, we like to use we language, right? We're a collective group of people. So you should be prepared for a follow-up question where if you're talking about a project that you worked on as part of a team, to be asked to clarify what your individual contribution was in that. Some other questions that you should have prepared answers for and be ready to answer. Tell me about yourself. Why have you decided to apply? And really, again, customize that to the job that you're talking about and focus on the contribution that you can make to the organization. In general, I think we all understand that people are not working just for the good of their health. We are looking to get paid, but I can tell you this, answering that question with, I just want more money is probably going to lose you the interview right there. Things like, what do you like to do outside of work? I'm not crazy about those because I don't really think it's relevant to identifying the best candidate. But I think, you will see that in some interviews. Again, that should enhance your overall narrative and emphasize the activities that kind of enhance that narrative of your professional skills. You might get questions like, why did you leave this company? What's this gap in your CV? Don't panic about things like that. Quite often you can give a positive answer around things like, I wanted to take an opportunity to travel, or I took time off to attend to caring obligations. Keep it very straightforward and brief. You can really be honest without having to share all the gory details. I think the only situation where that can get tricky is if there are gory details, if they're publicly searchable. And that's, again, probably a conversation for a whole different training session. You may also get things like, what are your strengths and weaknesses? I tend to think that one's coming from amateurs when you see that one, but it still crops up. Please just don't say that you're a workaholic. I think, for your weaknesses, I think that was possibly a clever answer about 35 years ago. But again, any decent employer is going to see that as a red flag rather than a clever answer. And then you should absolutely be expected to be asked, do you have any questions for us? And again, if you have shown thoughtful research into the organization and the role, that will stand you in good stead. So just another summary of interview do's and don'ts. So do show respect for the process. So that means showing up on time, dressing professionally, being polite to everybody that you interact with in the organization, right? From the minute you walk in the door. Keep your energy up, make eye contact with people. Do let the employer know if you need special accommodations to participate fully. I absolutely would be heartbroken if somebody felt that they'd been at a disadvantage because we didn't provide a needed accommodation for them. Do please take advantage of feedback. This varies in quality from employer to employer. I genuinely try to give people something that's actionable, like something that they can really change and do. And then also be yourself, because you do not want to be starting in a job that you've been hired to do on the basis that they think you're somebody totally different. That's not going to work for the employer, and it's not going to work for you. So don't be negative. Resist the temptation and questions when you're asked about, like, do you have colleagues that you've struggled to work with? What kind of people don't you like to work with? You always turn that around to, yes, there might have been a challenging situation or a challenging person. There always are, but here's how I made it work. Do not rush yourself when you're asked a question. I think that space of time between the question finishing and starting to talk, time just warps and bends and expands for people in that space, and they rush in. Take a beat, take a breath. It's okay. It just seems like people rush into it. It's so often you'll see people start to answer and then they'll stop and go, what was the question again? They kind of lose their train of thought. I've never, not never, rarely have I seen an interview board go, oh my God, that person was so slow. Just give yourself some time. Please do not weigh yourself down with a lot of props. It's not just sort of, bags, notebooks, water bottles. If you have the ability to leave the coat and bag in another room when you go in, that's great. Don't feel like you have to have a notepad just for the sake of looking like you've got something in your hands. It's not a problem for me. I don't, it doesn't hurt me at all to see somebody struggling with loads of bags and boxes and stuff. But you do see people starting to get panicked as they're trying to gather up all their belongings or put them down. So if you can streamline what you're bringing into the room, I just think it keeps people less distracted. And then also, don't beat yourself up. When I do interview feedback with people, the first question I ask is, how do you feel that it went? And I mean, most of the time people will start bringing up issues where they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I said this thing and I knew I lost everybody at that point. Like, nobody noticed that. You're such a worse critic towards yourself. So, every interview really is an opportunity to learn a little bit more, but people really do a lot better than they think they do in these things. And finally, go back. Let's keep some perspective on the process, right? There are always going to be more people often in excellent company. I would love nothing more than to flip the numbers and make 10 calls telling people they just got a job, and only having to tell one person the answer is no. And sometimes the feedback genuinely is, you did great, but someone else was just a better fit. Occasionally, employers are just being vague because they're afraid of being sued. But, quite often you did great. It was just a lot of people and only one job there. If you are not making progress in your job hunt and you aren't getting actionable feedback, consider seeking some outside support. So what making progress looks like for you, I would say, if you're going a year and you're getting no bites on the CV, if you are, getting into interviews and not succeeding and not getting the feedback you need, there are, consultants and organizations that will work you through a process, and hopefully can give you something to really make that little bit of difference. And then sometimes it really is just bad luck. Being the second choice 3 times in a row is painful, but it does happen. And then again, really see every application as an opportunity to refine and improve your CV. I started doing it as I was preparing this presentation, started thinking about my own CV. I have no intention of going anywhere. It was just kind of like, oh, what was I doing there? I should probably change that phrase. So it just is that opportunity every time. And, don't lose that perspective that there's so much to be gained, even if you don't get the job, because we are all always learning and growing. And that's it for me. So.
Wow. Thank you, Rebecca. Gosh, that was so much in that. I mean, there was a lot of content, but I think quite accessible content for people to pick up on, like really good tips Particularly around the email. I've come across myself over the years very dodgy email handles that people
Yeah, yeah.
use for their interview, and it really gives a bit of a weird perspective when somebody has something kind of very inappropriate that
Yes,
you wouldn't
yes.
have on their CV. That's their email address. So
Yeah, yeah, and look, I'm actually a fairly forgiving individual on this, but
mhm.
I've seen reactions come from people over things like that, where it's just like, oh no, where they literally they see things like that as a deal breaker.
Yeah.
So it really is safer to be conservative in that area.
So what I'm going to do is there's a few comments, and I think there might be some questions in there. So people are looking for your slides. So perhaps we can send those out to the list of people who've attended or registered,
Okay.
if you're happy with that.
Yeah.
Also, let me just go down through. So somebody just asked a question about what about a position that wants you to fill in an application form but not provide a CV? Do you have any tips around that?
Again, it's similar enough. I find as somebody who actually has been through that process, I find application forms kind of tedious, to be honest with you, and I don't like to put people through that. But you usually can, for lack of a better term, cannibalize a lot of the language you have in your CV for that. But
Okay.
that's the requirement. So yeah, you just got to do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Also some links to, maybe we can provide those as well to participants, some links to some good examples of CVs. So the
Absolutely.
CVs
Yep.
you mentioned, we'll send
Yep.
on those links as
Yep.
well.
Harvard Extension School Careers Office, if you want to look it up before we send you the link.
Okay. Harvard Extension Careers.
Harvard Extension School Careers Office.
Careers Office. Okay.
Yep.
Somebody asked a question around, I would like examples of how to demonstrate your leadership skills for an application. Is that too detailed, or do you
yeah,
have
I mean,
any
I think
guidance?
it's going to be context based. So I think that's one of the cases where I would say what you want to do is talk to the people who know you, right? So this is going to be based around the job that you've been doing, or maybe you have extracurricular activities or volunteer work where you're leading people. I think really talk to the people who know you well, because I think I can give good examples people have given of leadership, but that's not going to be relevant to you.
Okay. And I think also you mentioned around, extracurricular activities like coaching and stuff like that might demonstrate those skills. What about your trade union experience? Like, what's your view on putting that in?
Well, look, I think being a trade unionist, an activist, and a rep it gives people fantastic skills and transferable skills, right? Persuading, speaking, leadership, teamwork. These are all fantastic things. I am not going to be a naive Pollyanna to say that every employer out there is going to accept that the same way. So I think you do have to be judicious about how you're presenting that. I will say this, I mean, the number of people that approach me and go, you have HR in a union? Like I'll burst into flames the minute I walk in the office door. And look, before I worked, in Forza, my mother was a card carrying trade unionist. I have supported trade unionism my entire life. So, I've never been negatively predisposed throughout my career towards trade unionism. So there are HR people, there are hiring boards that will see this, for what it is, that it's actually a very altruistic activity to be involved. It's very pro-social. So it can be excellent, but obviously, if you know that you're applying to an openly union hostile employer, I wouldn't recommend that. But yeah, there's so many skills and competencies that are developed through that. But again, be careful about it. I think for the public service, for heavily unionized employments, it's probably safe enough because they're dealing with unionized workers all the time. It's not gonna scare them. They understand the value of having a unionized workforce.
Sure. Good advice there. Somebody just made a comment about they leave out the first. Can you leave out the first degree awarded because these might be a giveaway in age? So
yeah, look, I mean, I 2021, I started in Forza, and was not a spring chicken at that point, and would have thought, oh, is anybody going to want, old lady me on the job market? ageism is real. I think you can leave off dates. I think when people do that, it does kind of flag that this person's trying to hide something. I suppose the question I would ask is, do you want to work for an employer that's discriminating against people on the basis of age? You might want to give them a miss. I think people should own their experience.
Okay, great. So we have another question. I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, so maybe Anya could unmute if I don't get it right. She's saying most of us are lifelong public officers, and it's very hard to break into private sector per public perception of it. So any advice of reason for leaving? I'm not quite sure.
Well, I mean,
no, it is difficult. I mean, you're 20 years in the public service or more. And when I say public perception, I mean, God, people still call us tea drinkers.
Okay.
You work in, you just drink tea in there. And it's very hard to get people in the private sector who think that they're, slaving away. And they and it's very difficult to get over that bridge.
So I think there's a couple ways that you can approach this. I think I actually was with a single organization for nearly 20 years. So it wasn't public sector, but I think anybody who has a long service with one employer faces similar challenges around, seeming institutionalized. Can they adapt to a different organization, right? Like it's not dissimilar. Yes. And I think as well, like, look, if you're dealing with somebody who is that biased against the public service, that's probably they're not formulating that opinion on the basis of your CV. And realistically, there may not be anything that you're going to do to counteract their opinion of the public service. I think probably the more cynical way of approaching that would be to say, I am just such a dynamic person that I got to get out of that tea drinking environment. Like I think it would feel icky and feel a bit disloyal. But if you're just, sometimes these are some sort of cynical moves you have to make to actually just get past that barrier so that you can make the case for yourself. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Another question here. How do we overcome the why should we hire you question?
Well, I would turn that back to you, right? And I would say you think about that before you go in, because that's another good one, and you might want to expect that. Why should they hire you, right? Think about that before you go in. I think, again, what I've explained here is that they are looking for somebody who actually has demonstrated all of those relevant skills. So the answer to that question is always going to be some version of it, because I have the relevant skills, experience, and behaviors, and this is where I've done it. I've used this line in successful interviews, and I've heard people in Forsa give excellent interviews where the answer literally is, because I've done this job before. It's and then you elaborate on that. But that's really it all comes back to that. You are giving them the things they need. They're not looking to, not always, but they're not always looking to knock people out of the process. There's boxes that they need to tick. We need to see that these people have these skills. So you just give that back to them, and it's not a secret what they're looking for. It should be in the job description.
Sure, and have plenty of examples of those kind of like competencies.
Yep.
So Carmela said, sometimes you feel you did really well, but I don't. And when I felt I didn't do well, I actually did. Okay, so it's kind of like, it's hard to tell, I think, was what Carmela's trying to say. It's hard to tell when you do well and when you don't. So feedback, I presume, is a good thing to get.
Feedback's good. It like I said, some people are just intentionally vague when they give feedback. So you're never going to get anything actionable from that. I would say generally people do better than they think they did. I texted somebody after my Forsa interview and said, well, I don't think I'm the droid they're looking for. Here I am. I think, it is so common. Most of the feedback sessions I give, people are just like falling apart with, oh my God, I shouldn't have said that or done that. It's like, no, nobody noticed that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to know, when they say, if you have any question, are you allowed to ask a question to say, well, do you think I did well at this interview? I mean, is that a no-no? When you say valuation, I mean, they're not going to give you evaluation there and then.
No, and I'd say they'd be pretty wary about answering a question like that. Like I just think that is probably a little awkward for them in that moment, because you'd be very mindful of the fact that even if you did very well, if you've got 20 more people to interview and 10 of them do just that little bit better, you feel like you've raised somebody's hopes and expectations. I mean, one of the things I train interview boards on is that we want people walking out of that room with their dignity intact. So, even when people aren't doing well, we do try to be encouraging and kind to them. So I don't think that you're going to get an answer that is actually useful in that case. Yeah.
Okay, we have some more questions in the chat, so I just want to get to those because I think people have been waiting patiently. I always find my lowest scores from an interview comes from the teamwork competency. What are they looking for?
Again, every employer is going to be a little bit different. I think with teamwork, what I would identify, right? So like when we develop sort of worksheets for interviews, we don't have score sheets as such in Forsa. When we develop worksheets, we'll have kind of a general section with the competency at the top, and then we actually will have sort of lists of behaviors that we're looking for. And people can actually get little tick marks on that, even if they show those little behaviors in a different competency. For teamwork, the kinds of behaviors that I would be putting in there would be things like emphasizing listening to people, demonstrating concern for your colleagues. So I'm gonna draw a blank here. There are very, and ask yourself, like, what, one of the questions that comes up a lot, I like to use, so I'm giving this one away. Tell me about a team that you worked in that you felt was particularly high functioning, right? So take that opportunity to think about a team that you were part of that you thought worked really well. And so what was it about that? Quite often it's about everybody having a clearly defined role, people showing a willingness to support each other,
collaboration,
all of that.
Yeah. Okay, great. So when aiming to move into senior management, what is a good way of demonstrating leadership and elevating your analysis and decision-making skills to the level needed at senior management when you have no staff reporting to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a tough one. I think, again, that's where if you've got some of the extracurricular activities, you can lean on those. That's where you start to demonstrate that areas where you've gone above and beyond. Things like anticipating problems or concerns, showing support for your colleagues. If you are, if there are work experience students, if you've got any opportunity to mentor people, so not part of kind of an official reporting structure, those are all ways that you can start to demonstrate that. I think for a lot of jobs, and I'm so wary of this because I know I've just harped on for 30 minutes about demonstrating exactly the competencies you want. One of the things that I'm keenly aware of is that women in particular will not even throw an application in unless they meet like 400% of all of the requirements in it. In reality, most hiring people actually, the perfect candidate is somebody who's got a little space to grow into the role. If you hire somebody who is, so experienced, I don't like the word overqualified, but like bordering on overqualified, there will be the concern that they will be bored, that they will not stick around for very long. So you like to leave that little bit of room to grow into something.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rebecca. Kind of this, you probably covered some of this in the CV. Should you convey your experience as a union rep in an interview? And again, you've covered a little bit of that already.
Yeah, again, I would just say, I'm not going to be like a Pollyanna about this. This really depends on what you know about the employer and the people in the room. If you're dealing with people who are openly hostile to unions, I think that might be a topic that you stay away from. Sure. But that said, not every employer is hostile, right? So sure. Again, focus on all those fantastic transferable skills that you've developed as a rep, of which there are many.
Okay, and to get a little bit of advertisement in, Skills Academy can help you there with some training for reps. Yep. So get onto your branch. So what's a good way to end an interview if they say, have you any other questions or comments?
So I think, there are some standard ones that work pretty well. I think the safest question is, can you tell me a little bit about what kinds of outcomes you'd be expecting to see in year one in a role like this? I wouldn't, by all means, do not be giving your honest comments on how you thought the interview went. I think time and a place, and like, again, wouldn't personally bother me, but I can well imagine some members of interview board getting a little bit huffy about it. But I think that, there are some standard ones, but I think what really shines there is if you have actually done the research on the organization, and if you have a thoughtful question relating to the organization's goals, next steps, challenges that might be facing them, that will show that you've done your homework on it, and that is a real standout move in interviews.
Okay. Great. I'm going to fly through some of these because we have a couple more questions I want to get through. When a PhD is not required in the job description, but feedback from the interview board suggests the candidates with the extra qualification got higher marks, how do you advise on how to address this type of feedback?
Actually, it's kind of a challenging one for me. My first thought on that is that may not actually be what the reason was, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Quite often what the reason is somebody just kind of, did that little bit better. It was, they're very fine distinctions being made, right? Sure. You could have any one of three people who would have been fine in it, and you're just making that distinction, and the person is just giving you what seems like the most obvious reason. And I say this as somebody who spent 15 years interviewing people for management roles who were coming from academia with PhDs, but no management experience. So I would actually say, in my experience, somebody with a PhD where the role doesn't require a PhD is not something the employer is actually looking for.
Sure,
it can be a little more trouble than it's worth. But look, you got in the room, right? I mean, the answer could have been somebody just had a better example of their leadership skills rather than a PhD.
Sure.
Is it fair? Probably not, but I think as much as we try to remove subjectivity and make the interview process completely objective, it never is. It's always a work in progress.
Okay, thanks. In terms of references, lots of employers only state your start and end dates and job titles. Can you give additional people for a character reference in those instances?
Well, first of all, be guided on what the employer is actually asking you for. So, in Forsa, we can go with one reference if it's from your current employer. Just a little secret here for me is that I essentially only see references as a very minimal background and due diligence check. I think that finding 2 or 3 people who will say that you're not a serial killer is a pretty minimal bar to clear, right? Finding somebody who's going to say something nice about you. The main thing with references is that they're aware that you're giving their name. You've actually asked them and flagged it to them that this might be coming. I hate calling people or reaching out to people, and sometimes they don't even remember the person who's given the reference, or they're really startled by it. If a reference is good, that's kind of what I expect to hear. To be honest with you, it really is just a due diligence piece. But use the, I think if you can use a current employer or a recent employer, that really is the best possible thing. I just don't believe that anybody really takes the character reference that seriously, because I think we just assume you're going to find somebody who's going to say something nice about you.
Yeah, I know I worked for a large employer a number of years ago in HR, and a lot of employers were saying that they wouldn't give unwritten references, but they would give a statement of employment, but you could ring them and they would take a phone conversation. So that's what we would have done at that stage.
Yeah, and that's all just driven by fear about lawsuits, that you're going to say something terrible or wrong. But usually on an individual level, so like if you write through to the HR office, they might just be confirming dates of employment, but an individual person will take a call. And as long as, what I look to do there is just to verify that the person I'm calling is actually the person that works there. So like, is the email address connected to them? Is there a phone number that I can reach them through the company rather than just some random mobile number and they're saying that they're the CEO of whatever company? But yeah, that's fine. But like, look, the references I think are wildly overrated, to be honest with you.
Yeah. True. So what do you do if the third member of the board asks you some of the same questions as the first member of the board?
Answer them again. If you have those 10 to 12 examples, you probably have an example that, a different example to this, that fits, the same question, right? So that's just an opportunity to highlight a different area. So in some ways that's actually useful. Again, not every interview is well designed and skillful. But yeah, like I think, if you've got those 10 to 12 3-minute examples where they're cross-referenced with each other, usually there's another one that fits in. I also find sometimes, and this is really looking behind the scenes, the second day into interviews, end of the day, quite often you ask people a question and they give you this absolutely amazing example, and it's only kind of after they left the room that you go, that actually wasn't an example of the thing that I asked them about. But people are in such a lather, but that actually can kind of throw people sometimes. So it's like, oh yeah, that's a great story, and they kind of forget that it didn't answer the question.
Yeah. Okay. Just a couple more. I know we're hitting time.
Okay.
Someone's talking about going for senior position, but they asked for feedback and never received it. What should they do?
I suppose that's just a question of how persistent you want to be. I would, I think quite often people are just too busy / maybe too lazy to kind of take that step. So, send them a little meeting request, throw the ball into their court, and again, make it for something like 15 or 20 minutes. It doesn't need to take a long time. But, quite often, they forget that. They might be losing track of that. So I would try to do that pretty shortly after the interview, because memory starts to fade and interview notes are not always everything they should be. But like I would just be proactive on that and say, hey, how about next Tuesday at 3:45 and see what you get.
Sure. Okay. I'm going to take the last question next, because I think the other question is a little bit outside the remit. What do you do when you feel during the interview you're not connecting with the panel?
So this may not be something that's within your control. All right. So I would focus on, again, those sort of spheres of control. What can you do? I mean, if you are doing all the right things, if your energy is up, if you're making eye contact, but they're kind of not all there, it may have absolutely nothing to do with you and everything to do with the fact that maybe the last person that came through was a real energy suck and they're exhausted and they actually could have had a second cup of coffee before this interview started. So what I would say is just focus on your piece. I know it's hard to be pushing that energy out there when you're not getting it back. And again, a well-trained board, will get up, will, put our star hands and move around just to kind of keep our energy from getting to that space. But that's just one of the challenges there. And just remember, it's not necessarily you, right? Just keep focused on the fundamentals that you can control.
Yeah. So the absolute final question is a question around paneling. When there's only one job advertised, but they create a panel for 2 years, what's that about? Why do boards do that?
Because this is a new one for me, because Forza is my first experience with panels. That is I can speak to why Force is doing it, and I think it's probably not dissimilar reasons to other organizations. That is because if you have a formal and well-crafted interview process, if you are bringing in external board members, again, to try to reduce bias and have fairness there, that's a big kind of a process to coordinate, right? And so you might be seeing a lot of applicants in one go. And so you just say, like, look, we know that people will be here and be available and are interested. And we are anticipating that there will be future vacancies within whatever set period of time they've identified that the panel is going to last, if they can reasonably anticipate. So it's usually larger organizations that you can anticipate that there will be vacancies coming up. That's how, the why of the panel, because it does allow for a more elaborate interview process than, because you really couldn't do something like that 5 times a year. It allows you to do it all in one concentrated burst.
Sure. Oh, okay, great. Well, that is the end of our questions. Rebecca, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you guys. This was really fun.
It's been great. It's been great. We've had over 100 people on the call over lunchtime, so it's fantastic, and it will be made available by on the recording. And if people have any other questions that we haven't had a chance to answer, please, we will try and contact you later on and maybe make those answers available to you. But also, if anyone has any training issues or they have any questions around any other topics for Lunch and Learn, please contact skillsacademy@forsa.ie. And all that's left for me to say is thanks again to Rebecca, and wishing everybody a fantastic bank holiday weekend and happy Halloween. And see you all again soon at the end of next month for the next Lunch and Learn at the end of November. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a million.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Amelia.